They tried to silence the fire of words. But every poem became a revolution. Darkness. The sound of a pen scratching paper. Snow falling over old St. Petersburg. A candle flickers. My name is Alexander Pushkin. And before the world called me a legend, I was a man hunted by power, obsessed with freedom, and cursed with a voice too dangerous to ignore. Slow orchestral music rises. In this channel, stories do not sleep in dusty books. They breathe, they bleed, they live again. So before we open the pages of destiny, subscribe now. Become part of this journey through history, literature, and the minds that changed the world forever. Pushkin's voice softens, almost like a whisper. Trust me, once you enter this story, you will never see poetry the same way again. I was born in Moscow, in the year 1799. A child of noble blood, but never a child of peace. Soft piano music. Old paintings fade onto the screen. My father, Sergei Pushkin, was a proud aristocrat. A man who loved literature, French culture, and the elegance of high society. But he was distant, cold at times, more interested in reputation than fatherhood. My mother, Nadezhda Pushkina, she carried a story inside her blood. Her grandfather was Abram Ganable, an African man brought to Russia who later became a respected general under Peter the Great. The music grows deeper. And maybe that is where I inherited my fire. The feeling of being different. Of never fully belonging. As a child, I was quiet, observant. Always hiding in books while the world around me chased status and appearances. French was spoken more than Russian in noble homes. But the soul of Russia did not live in French salons. It lived in stories. Warm firelight appears on screen. My grandmother, and especially my beloved nanny, Irina Rodionovna. They filled my nights with Russian fairy tales, legends, songs, and folklore. While the aristocracy worshipped Europe, I was falling in love with Russia itself. And that love would one day change Russian literature forever. Music pauses for a second. But even as a child, there was already something dangerous growing inside me. A sharp tongue, a rebellious spirit, and words powerful enough to challenge an empire. At the age of 12, I was sent away to the Imperial Lyceum in Tsarskoye Selo. Wide cinematic shot of a Grand Royal Academy covered in winter snow. It was no ordinary school. It was built to shape the future elite of the Russian Empire. Politicians, diplomats, men loyal to the Tsar. But inside those halls, I discovered something far more dangerous than politics. Freedom. Music slowly intensifies. I wrote constantly. Poems about love, ambition, rebellion. While others memorized rules, I questioned them. My classmates saw talent. My teachers saw trouble. And soon, all of Russia began to notice. Old manuscripts appear on screen with ink spreading across paper. Even as a teenager, my poetry carried fire. I mocked corruption. I criticized tyranny. I spoke about liberty at a time when silence was safer. The Russian Empire after Napoleon was tense, afraid of revolution. And young writers like me became symbols of dangerous ideas. The music becomes darker. By the time I graduated, my words had already reached the highest circles of society. And not everyone was pleased. The Tsar watched carefully. Censors followed every line I wrote. Friends warned me to stay quiet. Pause. But I could not. Because once a poet tastes freedom, he can never return to chains. St. Petersburg, the heart of the Russian Empire. The camera moves slowly through dark streets lit by lanterns. Snow falls softly while horse carriages cross the city at night. When I arrived there after graduating from the Lyceum, I was no longer just a talented student. People already knew my name. In aristocratic salons, nobles whispered my poems to each other. Young officers admired my courage. Writers saw me as the future of Russian literature. But fame, in the Russian Empire, was dangerous. Slow dramatic music begins building. Russia in the early 19th century was ruled by fear. The Tsar wanted obedience. The government feared rebellion more than anything else. And Europe had already shown what rebellion could do. Quick flashes of the French Revolution. Crowds. Fire. Kings falling. The ideas of liberty and revolution were spreading across the continent like wildfire. And in Russia, even poetry could become a weapon. I was young, passionate, arrogant, perhaps. I believed words could change the world. The screen shows ink spreading across paper as Pushkin writes furiously. So I wrote poems attacking corruption, mocking powerful officials, and defending freedom of thought. One of my poems secretly circulated through St. Petersburg society. It criticized tyranny so openly that the authorities became alarmed. Suddenly, my poetry was no longer entertainment. It was a threat. Music becomes tense. The Tsar's government began watching me closely. My letters were monitored. My conversations reported. Friends warned me constantly. Pushkin, be careful. Pushkin, they are listening. Pushkin, you are going too far. But I ignored them. Because deep inside, I enjoyed the danger. Camera slowly zooms toward a candle burning beside unfinished manuscripts. I spent my night surrounded by writers, officers, intellectuals, and dreamers. We talked about freedom, justice, and the future of Russia. These discussions would later inspire the Decembrists, a revolutionary movement that wanted constitutional reform and limits on the Tsar's power. Many of those men became my close friends. And because of that, the government started seeing me not only as a poet, but as a possible revolutionary. Thunder sound effect. Silence for a moment. Finally, in 1820, the empire decided it had enough of Alexander Pushkin. I was summoned by the authorities. My writings were condemned. Exile was discussed. Some officials even wanted harsher punishment. But my fame protected me. Instead of prison, I was sent away from the capital. Wide cinematic shot of a lonely road stretching into the distance. Exile. A punishment meant to silence me. But the empire made one terrible mistake. Music rises slowly. They believed distance would weaken my voice. In reality, it was only the beginning of my legend. The South. Golden sunlight over endless fields. Mountains in the distance. The sound of wind and horses. When the empire exiled me from St. Petersburg, they thought they were removing a problem. But exile did something unexpected. It changed me. For the first time in my life, I was far away from the cold aristocratic world of the capital. Far away from salons, royal etiquette, and the suffocating eyes of censorship. I traveled through southern Russia, through the Caucasus, Crimea, places filled with wild nature, warriors, legends, and freedom. The camera sweeps across cliffs, oceans, and stormy skies. And suddenly, my poetry became larger. Before exile, I wrote with anger. Now, I wrote with passion. I fell in love with landscapes, with adventure, with the idea of the lonely hero fighting against fate. These years transformed me into a romantic writer. Slow orchestral music rises. I met soldiers, travelers, exiles, and rebels. I listened to stories about war, betrayal, honor, and impossible love. And all of it entered my writing. During this period, I created some of my most important works, poems and stories that made my fame spread across all of Russia. Old pages appear on screen. The Prisoner of the Caucasus. The Fountain of Bakhchisarai. The Gypsies. These were not just poems anymore. They were alive. Pause. But despite the beauty of exile, I was still trapped. No matter where I traveled, the government followed me. My letters were opened. My movements observed. Every new poem passed through censorship. And worst of all, music darkens. My own personality often became my enemy. I was impulsive, quick to anger, proud beyond reason. I argued constantly. I offended powerful people. I challenged men to duels over insults, gossip, or wounded pride. Alexander Pushkin was becoming famous across the empire. But he was also becoming dangerous to himself. Rain begins falling softly. And then, another disaster arrived. In 1824, the authorities discovered private letters where I criticized religion and the government. This time, the punishment became harsher. I was removed from public life completely. No cities, no society, no freedom. I was sent to my family's estate in Mikhailovsk, isolated in the countryside. A lonely house appears surrounded by endless silence. The empire wanted silence. But in isolation, I would create the work that changed Russian literature forever. Mikhailovsk. Snow-covered countryside. A lonely wooden estate. Wind moving through empty fields. This was not exile anymore. It was erasure. No salons. No conversations. No applause. Only silence and time. At first, I resisted it. I walked endlessly through the estate, furious at the world, furious at the empire, furious at my own fate. But slowly, something changed. The music softens. A pen scratching paper returns. Silence became my teacher. In that isolation, I read more deeply than ever before. I studied history, Shakespeare, Byron, Dante, and I returned to something I had almost forgotten. Russian life itself. My nanny, Irina Rodionovna, was still with me in memory and spirit. She told me stories at night, old folk tales, songs of peasants, legends passed down through generations. And in that remote countryside, I began to hear Russia again. Not the Russia of nobles and emperors, but the Russia of real people. Camera shows peasants in snow, fires burning in huts, faces full of hardship and dignity. And then, I started writing differently. No longer only poetry of rebellion or beauty, but something deeper. Humanity. It was here, in isolation, that the idea of Eugene Onegin was born. A slow dramatic rise in music. A story not of kings or battles, but of a man like me. A man full of intelligence, boredom, pride, and emotional blindness. A man who destroys what he loves, simply because he does not understand how to hold on to it. I was not just writing fiction. I was writing truth disguised as poetry. The sound of pages turning. Stanzas formed like music. Rhythm became conversation. And Russian life became literature. But while I was creating my greatest work, the outside world was still dangerous. Even in exile, even in silence, I was not free. The empire watched. The censors waited. And my reputation grew into something uncontrollable. Then, in 1826, everything changed again. The new Tsar, Nicholas I, summoned me personally. I was no longer just a writer in exile. I was a figure the state could not ignore. Slow tension builds. And so, I left Mikhailovsk. Not as a prisoner, but not as a free man either. I returned to St. Petersburg, to face the empire that had created me. St. Petersburg, again. The city appears colder this time. Not just winter cold, political cold. Guards at every corner. Eyes behind every window. When I returned, I was no longer the same man who left. I had become something more complicated. A poet who the empire could not ignore. Soft, tense music. Horse hooves echo on stone streets. I was brought directly before Tsar Nicholas I, the most powerful man in Russia, and the man who now held my future in his hands. I expected punishment, censorship, restrictions, maybe even imprisonment. But what I received instead was something far more dangerous. A dimly lit imperial room. Candles. Silence. The Tsar looked at me and spoke calmly. Alexander Pushkin, I will be your personal censor. Think about that. Not a jailer. Not an exile order. But a personal overseer of my words. He promised protection in exchange for control. My writings would no longer pass through faceless officials. They would pass through the Tsar himself. The music titans. And just like that, I was free. But not free at all. Back in the capital, life split into two worlds. In one world, I was celebrated. I was invited to salons again. Read my poetry aloud. Heard applause return like a distant memory. In the other world, I was watched. Every letter I wrote, every friendship I formed, every opinion I expressed, could become dangerous. Camera shows ink dripping slowly onto paper. So I learned to live carefully. To write with hidden meanings. To smile in public and think in silence. But there was another shift happening in my life. Something more personal. I met Natalia Gonkarova. Soft light. A ballroom. A young woman surrounded by attention. She was young, admired, and considered one of the most beautiful women in Russia. And I was already a man marked by fame and controversy. I fell in love quickly. Too quickly. My emotions were never moderate. They burned. At first, it felt like salvation. A new beginning. A life beyond censorship, exile, and politics. But love in my world was never simple. Music darkened slightly. The higher society adored Natalia. And I, a poet with enemies and debts, was not seen as the perfect match. I knew it. But I pursued her anyway. Because I had never learned how to step back from anything I desired. During these years, I wrote constantly. Eugene Onegin grew, line by line, stanza by stanza. But even as I wrote about fictional lives, my real life was becoming increasingly unstable. Financial pressure, social tension, growing resentment from powerful circles. And beneath it all, something older than all of that. Honor culture. Duels. A sharp violin sting. In Russia, words were never just words. They were challenges. And I had spent my entire life speaking too freely. I told myself I was careful now. That I had learned restraint. But restraint was never my strength. A single insult, a misunderstanding, a gesture taken the wrong way. And the entire world could shift in an instant. Silence. And somewhere ahead, I could feel it. something tightening, like a rope pulled slowly, patiently, around my future, not yet visible, but already there. Fade to black. And I, Alexander Pushkin, was walking toward it without knowing its name. Some moments in life arrive quietly. Snow again. The city feels tighter. Narrow streets. Whispers behind fans in salons. They don't announce themselves with thunder. They come as letters left unread, as smiles that last half a second too long, as names spoken in the wrong tone at the wrong table. In St. Petersburg, reputation was not a reflection of who you were. It was a weapon others used to define you. By now, my name carried weight across the empire. Some said I was Russia's greatest living poet. Others said I was reckless, dangerous, impossible to control. But fame is not protection. It is exposure. Slow music builds, uneasy. And when you live in a world built on pride, even a whisper can become a challenge. It began, as these things always begin, not with war, but with words. A rumor, a misunderstanding, a joke repeated in the wrong room, and then silence that felt heavier than any insult. I had learned many things in my life. How to write, how to survive exile, how to stand before emperors without trembling. But I never truly learned how to let things go. Camera holds on a candle flame flickering dangerously low. There was a man named Georges Dianthes, a foreign officer in Russian service. Charismatic, confident, always smiling in a way that made people unsure what he was thinking. And he entered my life, through proximity, through society, through the fragile world of appearances. At first, it was nothing. Polite exchanges, even laughter in the same rooms. But in that world, nothing stays nothing for long. Rumors began to form around my wife, Natalia. Words twisted, stories invented, suspicion spread faster than truth ever could. And I became what I always was. Sensitive, proud, quick to wound, and quicker still to defend what I loved. I wrote letters. I demanded answers. I confronted shadows as if they were solid enemies. But shadows never fight fairly. They multiply. Music turns darker, and soon, honor demanded a price. In my world, a man did not simply ignore insult. He answered it. Or he ceased to be a man in the eyes of others. I told myself I was protecting my name. But deeper than that, I was protecting something more fragile. My identity. My dignity. My place in a society that both celebrated and condemned me. And that is how the line is crossed. Not loudly, not suddenly, but inevitably. One morning, the message arrived. A sealed envelope, wax stamp, the sound of paper breaking, a challenge, a duel. And with it, the illusion of control ended. I did not feel fear immediately. Instead, clarity. As if a long story that had been writing itself without me had finally reached its final page. Wind grows stronger outside. I thought about my life. My childhood filled with stories. My exile across endless landscapes. My years of writing under watchful eyes. My love. My pride. My mistakes that always wore the mask of conviction. And I understood something then. I had always believed I was fighting for freedom. But perhaps I was also fighting against my own limits. The morning of the duel arrived. Cold air. Heavy silence. A world that felt paused. Two men walking toward a line neither of them truly controlled. Music becomes minimal. Almost nothing. I won't tell you what happened in detail. Because the truth of that moment is not in what was done, but in what was decided long before it. What matters is this: that a poet, a man who believed words could reshape reality, was finally confronted by the weight of reality itself. And as I stood there, I thought not of politics, not of society, not even of fame. I thought of unfinished lines, of stories I would never complete, of silence I had mistaken for endless time. If you are listening to my story now, remember this: lives are not only shaped by greatness, but by the small fractures we refuse to notice, until they become impossible to repair, fade to black. And in that final moment, I was no longer a legend, no longer a symbol, just a man, standing inside the consequences of everything he had ever been. The field was quiet. Grey sky, bare trees, a frozen silence that feels heavier than sound. Two men stood at a distance that felt both infinite and unavoidable. Snow beneath their boots had turned hard, as if the earth itself refused to soften what was about to happen. I remember the cold most of all. Not fear, not anger, just cold. Georges Dianth stood opposite me, calm, composed, almost too composed, as if we were both participants in something already decided long before we arrived. A doctor stood nearby, a witness, a clock that did not need to speak to count down. I held the pistol in my hand, and for a brief moment, I stopped thinking like a man inside a conflict. I started thinking like a man outside his own life. All my years came at once. My childhood filled with stories. My exile across endless landscapes. My ambition, my pride, my impatience. My words that built admiration and enemies. My love, my mistakes. Everything that I once believed was separate now felt like one continuous line leading to this exact point. A signal was given. Silence sharpens. 2 steps. 3. And then, the world changed its shape. I fired. The sound echoes, distant yet final. And almost instantly, I knew. There are moments when the body understands before the mind does. A shock. A pause that feels longer than time itself. And then, reality returns in fragments. I was hit. The force was not dramatic like in stories. It was precise. I remember falling. Not collapsing like a legend, but like a man whose balance suddenly no longer belongs to him. They rushed toward me. Voices became noise. Shapes became shadows. And the sky stayed exactly the same. Indifferent. Unmoved. I tried to speak. But words, for the first time in my life, did not obey me. And in that silence, I understood something painfully simple. All the language I had mastered, all the poems I had written, all the arguments I had ever won, could not negotiate with this moment. They carried me away from the field. The duel was over. But something larger had begun. The next hours are not memory in the way other memories are. They are fragments. A room. Faces leaning in. A doctor's expression he tries to hide. A hand holding mine too tightly. I was told that I was badly wounded. That time was not on my side. But even then, I was still thinking in sentences. Not of fear, but of meaning. They say a man sees his life before the end. I did not see my life as a straight line. I saw it as words. Incomplete. Interrupted. Still trying to become something whole. My wife. My friends. My books. My unfinished one gin. All of it, suddenly felt unbearably far. And unbearably close. And if there is one truth I can leave behind, it is this: a poet does not only live in ink. He lives in the echoes of what his words awaken in others. My name is Alexander Pushkin. And though my story ends here, the story I helped begin does not fade slowly, because words, unlike men, do not die on the field. After that moment, everything became quieter. The sound fades. The world slows. Candlelight replaces daylight. They say time moves differently when life is slipping away. And they are right. I remember faces leaning over me. Voices trying to sound calm, but failing to hide the cracks. Doctors speaking in low tones. Friends refusing to meet each other's eyes. And somewhere in that room, the empire I once challenged stood silently inside the consequences. I was no longer the man they debated in salons. No longer the name whispered with admiration or suspicion. I had become something simpler. A life measured in breaths. My thoughts were not loud. They were small, precise, like distant echoes of everything I had ever written. I thought of my mother, my father, my childhood filled with foreign words and Russian stories, my nanny's voice, carrying tales older than empires. I thought of St. Petersburg, not as a capital of power, but as a city of cold light and endless conversations. And I thought of her, my wife, not as rumor or scandal, but as a person standing inside a storm she never asked for. There is a strange clarity at the edge of everything. You no longer argue with fate. You simply observe it finishing its sentence. I was Alexander Pushkin. Alexander Pushkin. And for the first time in my life, I was not trying to shape the story. I was inside its final paragraph. They tell me I spoke softly near the end. Not in grand poetry. Not in speeches. But in simple words that belonged more to feeling than to literature. And then, the word stopped. But silence is never empty. It carries everything that came before it. My poems. My exile. My love. My pride. My defiance. All of it continued living somewhere beyond me. And so the man ends. But the voice does not. Because I learned too late that a poet does not own his legacy. He releases it. And it travels farther than his life ever could. If you are hearing this story now, then I have already succeeded in one thing. I did not escape fate, but I turned it into language. And language does not end. Fade to black. Only transforms. After the silence came the world's reaction. Black screen slowly fades into candlelit rooms filled with whispers. It did not take long for news to spread. Alexander Pushkin was gone. Alexander Pushkin. And yet, in St. Petersburg, the empire did not know how to treat his absence. Because he was not just a writer anymore. He had become a symbol. At first, there was control. Authorities tried to manage the narrative, to contain the noise, to reduce the impact of a death that felt larger than politics. But something unexpected happened. The silence did not calm the people. It intensified them. Crowds gathered. Not as rebels, but as readers. As mourners of words. As if something essential in the world had been torn away. Soft wind over snowy streets. His funeral became a quiet protest, even when it was not allowed to be one. People did not speak loudly. But they came anyway. And behind closed doors, his enemies fell silent. Because even those who disliked him understood something irreversible had happened. You cannot argue with a dead genius. You can only inherit him. In the days that followed, his manuscripts were gathered, protected, hidden, published. And slowly, something began to rise. Not a man, but a legacy. The works he left behind began to breathe on their own. Stories that once felt dangerous became foundational. Poetry that once irritated power became national identity. From this point forward, Russian literature changed direction. Writers who came after him did not simply admire him. They measured themselves against him. His influence reached far beyond his time. Writers like Fyodor Dostoevsky and Leo Tolstoy grew in a world already shaped by his voice. Not because he taught them directly, but because he proved something irreversible. That Russian literature could stand on its own, against Europe, against empire, against silence. And so the man who once was censored became unavoidable. The empire that tried to guide his words lost control of his echo. And time did what it always does. It softened politics. It erased grudges. It buried names of officials and scandals and court fears. But it did something else too. It preserved his voice. Because Alexander Pushkin did not belong only to his century. He belonged to language itself. And if you listen closely, in every poem that dares to speak freely, in every story that refuses silence, in every writer who chooses truth over safety, you will hear him. Not as a memory, but as a beginning. And that is how a life ends. And becomes something that never ends at all. Fade out. The poet is gone. But the words are still alive. The screen fades from black, but the silence remains. And now, the story is over. But not really. Soft wind. Distant piano notes. I was Alexander Pushkin. Alexander Pushkin. I lived in words. I fought with words. I was destroyed by a world that feared words. And yet I am still here. Because a poet does not truly leave. He disperses. Into every sentence that dares to feel too much. Into every story that refuses to obey silence. Into every voice that chooses truth over comfort. Music slowly rises. If you have followed this journey, if you have walked through exile, love, pride, and fate, then you already know something important. Stories are not history. They are inheritance. And now, this is your moment. If you want more stories like this, stories that breathe, that bleed, that refuse to stay buried, then subscribe. Because this is not the end of history. This is where it begins again. And remember, you are not just watching the past. You are listening to it, still trying to speak. Fade to black. I was Alexander Pushkin. And I never truly stopped speaking.